Hello everyone. In this presentation, I, Sumi Dubey, along with my teammate Caleb Chukwu, will be talking about the roles of cities and services in expanding the international trade and investment policy agenda. We explore the public policy implications of two new, significant and interrelated global phenomena. First, the rising share of services in foreign trade and multinational enterprise activity, and second, the increasingly important role of global cities as home and host to these activities. National economic diplomacy has traditionally promoted trade and investment in goods, often through trade agreements and promotional agencies, and we explore the limitations of these tools as trade and services become more important. However, we also note that trade in services, particularly innovation-driven services, is concentrated in global cities and traded between them, often within multinational enterprises. Here are some of the abbreviations that we'll be using throughout the presentation. The process of globalization has meant that international trade and investment increased rapidly in the post-war period and especially after 1990 as transportation and communication costs fell, allowing the emergence of global value chains that supported greater trade and foreign investment in goods. In this paper, we offer a perspective on the ways in which traditional trades and investment policy framework may need to be modified to consider these increasingly significant new phenomenon. We consider the twin policy options of trade and investment deals and trade and investment promotion activities and emphasize services as well as goods. This framework involves two tiers, whereby countries first set the rules of the game and then firms respond to those rules by choosing and negotiating location strategies. We then extend this to propose a three-tier framework that incorporates city diplomacy into the framework. City diplomacy defines the ways in which cities can represent their interest internationally, both with other cities and with other relevant organizations. City diplomacy therefore includes formal and informal agreements between cities with activities surrounding city-level agreements, including efforts to promote the city as a home to network of multinational enterprises. We conclude that global cities can accelerate many of the distance-related obstacles to trade and investment growth, notably in services, and that much greater attention to city-based trade and investment policies is warranted. We emphasize that national economic diplomacy should encompass innovation and that this will require a better alignment with cities and city diplomacy. Finally, we conclude that many shift towards city diplomacy may affect the non-market capabilities of multinational enterprises, requiring them to adjust their own diplomatic and corporate networks. We illustrate many of these ideas using the example of the Alphabet Google Sidewalk Labs projected in Toronto, Canada. Economic diplomacy refers to state actions that open markets to trade and investment, including multilateral treaties and various promotion activities that cross borders. In our framework, the first tier involves state actions and the second tier involves interaction between the state and firms. In the first tier, at the country level, we identify two forms of economic diplomacy. Trade diplomacy, which includes treaty commitments by the state, both bilateral and multilateral, and commercial diplomacy, which involves each state establishing specific agencies to promote trade and investment. We refer to the latter in the text as TPAs, but depending on the country, investment and export promotion can be separate, and each can encompass a wide range of activities from incentives to using trade and diplomatic missions. We also distinguish agencies focused on investment promotion and export promotion. In Tier 1, the state engages in trade diplomacy through trade and investment agreements that limit special transaction cost by lowering trade barriers, and reduces political risk by offering protection against arbitrary state action. In addition, the state takes measure to promote trade and investment by creating agencies to provide information, incentives, and resources to address market failures associated by information arising because potential investors and exporters lack specific information. At the firm level, in Tier 2, we find multinational enterprises responding to these state actions by choosing the appropriate locations for trade and investment and by negotiating conditions for market entry, often involving their own corporate diplomacy initiatives. We use this framework to consider the adequacy of policy tools to promote contemporary trade and investment with a specific focus on trade and investment in services. Most of the empirical evidence on international trade and investment is derived from some version of the gravity model, which proposes that trade or FDI between countries is driven by the size of the home economy, the size of the host economy, and the distance between them. Gravity models therefore suggest that it is not random with whom countries and firms trade or undertake FDI. The economic size of either partner increases trade and FDI, while distance between them, capturing frictional factors, and behind that transaction cost reduces both. Thus, trade and investment in goods remains an area where physical distance continue to matter, and it is not surprising that recent evidence suggests that deepening trade relationship with near partners may be more effective in expanding existing trade, while trade agreements focused on goods with more distant partners may not be as effective. On the other hand, some studies find that physical distance is important for trade and services, although the costs are declining over time. In addition, economic diplomacy has proved problematic in case of services. In summary, while geographic distance may at times matter less for trade and services, contextual distance matters a great deal. Cities, particularly global cities, provide access to a wide variety of complementary services, large pool of specialized labor, and a sophisticated transportation and communication infrastructure. Large global cities are not only critical to the world economy, but there is also a symbiotic and codependent relationship between knowledge-based MNEs and global cities. The link between the location of higher value-added activities and city occur because cities can minimize the special transaction cost related to trade in knowledge-based services. Countries, and in the case of services and intangible goods, cities tend to specialize in some specific segments of GVC. However, while the emergence of global cities is about the location of high-value elements of the value chain, it is also about the location of professional business services firms which locate around the globe and in process help to create networks of connected cities. Although the importance of cities has been studied by economic geographers, it has until recently been less prominent in the international business literature, which has viewed these location issues from a country perspective. Role of cities as essential components of process of knowledge creation and diffusion across border is now an increasing recognition by scholars. Although, as we have seen, cities play a critical role in facilitating international trade and investment in services, they are very rarely part of the policy conversation, at least in the international business literature. We therefore propose to recognize the importance of this network of global cities by augmenting a previous framework with what we refer to as a three-tier framework of economic diplomacy. The new framework explicitly accounts for cities and the location preference of services and knowledge-based MNEs and is therefore more place-sensitive. Many global cities have an international strategy, often represented by a dedicated international office. While cities cannot sign treaties in the same way as nation-states, they do engage in both bilateral and multilateral arrangements. Such initiatives are not specifically commercial in nature, but create channels of information and cultural exchange that can result in locational advantages for member cities. Urban policy is therefore linked to national policies with the same goals of promoting international trade and investment, providing a possible link between national and city-based commercial diplomacy. We conclude that global cities are deeply engaged in city economic diplomacy, both through the creation of city networks and through commercial diplomacy linked to the creation of TIPAs. And these activities appear to complement comparable policy at the national level. But the degree to which this is true or the effectiveness of the policies is unclear. Now Caleb will take over to explain the rest of the presentation.
I'll be discussing modifying trade and investment policies in light of a changing world, and I'll focus on the development of trade agreements between countries with deeper and broader trade in services provision and city-based trade and investment promotion. Trade in services is more complicated than trade in goods because it involves a diverse range of cross-border transactions, such as movements of knowledge, people, and capital. Many of these service transactions are relation-specific, making contract negotiation and the developing of rules to protect contract negotiation in a trade agreement difficult. Because of this, service agreements must include provisions on foreign ownership, cross-border movement of people, and intellectual property, in addition to addressing new areas such as digital services and e-commerce. Just as trade in services has grown rapidly in the last few decades, so have the rules that govern it. The World Trade Organization currently lists 302 active regional trade agreements, many of which were negotiated during the 90s, during a period of rapid growth in services. The majority of these agreements include provisions for trade in services, but there is little evidence that they have been successful. Some existing agreements negotiated by the World Trade Organization include Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Trade in Services Agreement. Most of these agreements have been rendered irrelevant by their inability to address changing service sector dynamics. Even though there have been some recent advances, more trade agreements need to be added to facilitate the rapid increase in trade in services, and the scope and depth of new trade agreements on services must be expanded. Also, because traditional trade rules do not fully recognize the reality of cross-border service activity, in which services act as intermediary inputs in global value chains, more policies need to be added to reduce regulatory barriers to service market access. Cities play a vital role in trade and investment promotion, and they need to create policies which foster innovation. This can attract knowledge-based foreign direct investment and promote trade in knowledge-based services, as well as facilitate the creation of homegrown multinational enterprises. There is also a considerable support for the merging of trade and investment functions between the World Bank and the United Nations. Investment and trade promotion activities support each other in a way that promoting inbound foreign direct investment improves export competitiveness, and so many countries have adopted this approach, including the United Kingdom, with a clear focus on cities. Further steps still need to be taken to include innovation, and as reported by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, only 28% of investment promotion agencies perform both innovation and export promotion, and they suggest that this is a good choice when investment promotion agencies seek to attract high-tech and research and development driven multinational enterprises that can invest in high value added activities. It should also be noted that though cities engage in their own form of economic diplomacy, the nature of these activities remain understudied and poorly understood. While more research is required in these areas, there is some evidence that the scope of trade and investment promotion agencies varies across cities. For example, the Vancouver Economic Commission works to position Vancouver as a globally recognized city for innovative, creative, and sustainable business. This means that the Economic Commission in Vancouver acts to both attract foreign investment and promote Canadian firms at home and abroad. And they have followed a very targeted strategy in terms of sectors, focusing on high technology, digital entertainment, and green economy sectors, and the development of local clusters that support them. Vancouver offers a model of trade and investment promotion agency that combines elements of investment, trade, and innovation promotion. Although it has a global network centered around cities, it has a particular focus on the Asia Pacific and in that way works to diversify trade. In comparison, London and Partners is the mayor of London's official promotion agency, and like Vancouver, its scope includes both foreign and domestic investment promotion, but it considers a broader set of industries and activities. For example, it is responsible for conventions, travel and tourism, and overseas students. London and Partners explicitly supports innovation and cluster development in the range of knowledge-intensive sectors and links them to both foreign direct investment and trade. They have also created a trade and investment promotion agency that combines innovation, trade, and foreign direct promotion, just like the Commission in Vancouver. And these are just few examples that highlight how little we know about city-level diplomacy. The table on this slide was gotten from the Globalization and World Cities database. It shows cities across the world and their trade and investment promotion agency, as well as the strategy adopted by these agencies to promote investment. The table is organized around strategic elements common to many organizations, including governance, horizontal scope, vertical scope, and geographic scope. From the slide, it shows that although most trade and investment promotion agencies of the relevant city are public agencies, in a few cities like London and Chicago, they form a public-private partnership, and some agencies are separate non-profit entities. In the case of Toronto, the horizontal scope of activities varies from a relatively narrow focus on investment promotion to investment promotion plus support such as training, subsidies, consulting, to an extremely broad mandate that can include trade and tourism and broad economic development. Most cities also have other related agencies to focus on trade or innovation and entrepreneurship. From the perspective of horizontal scope, there is considerable diversity among the strategic choices made by the agencies. Some agencies are responsible for broader economic development in their city and some are not. The vertical scope sector strategies are more uniform in their sector, and most agencies focus on knowledge and technology-based services. However, a small number of agencies listed more traditional industries such as manufacturing and aerospace. The sample on the table is limited, and it remains to be seen whether a broader sample would also suggest a strategic focus by cities on this same sector. The geographic scope of the sample exhibits considerable variation, both in terms of the number of countries in which they are represented and in terms of how they choose to be represented. City-level agencies exist in all major global cities in the sample and are active across a range of policy areas. The most striking thing about the table is the scale and range of the activities. An important outstanding policy question remains how the activities of these agencies can be understood as part of a national trade and investment strategy, and the fact that most of the agencies tend to focus on knowledge and technology-based business suggests the importance of creating a well-defined city strategy that is differentiated both within and across countries. So here's a summary from the previous table. trade and investment promotion agency form a public-private partnership in a few cities. From the perspective of horizontal scope, there is diversity among the strategic choices made by the trade agencies. Vector sector strategies are more uniform as most trade and investment promotion agencies focus on knowledge and technology-based services. And the national government has a very important role to play in city economic diplomacy, as cities rely on trade commissioners, trade missions, and other services provided in various countries by their national government. The transition to a more city-based diplomacy may have consequences for corporate diplomacy, which involves building relationships with relevant external stakeholders, and corporations can build strong capabilities in managing these relationships. Firms are likely to have focused their corporate diplomacy on national or regional institutions and stakeholders. While this may continue to be important, it is also clear that the emergence of global cities may require multinational enterprises to reorient their strategies and capabilities to accommodate local politics. This is illustrated in the Sidewalk Lab case study. Sidewalk Labs, a private company engaged in the design, development, and building of smart cities, and entered into a partnership with Waterfront Toronto, a public agency created by the federal and Ontario government and the City of Toronto to oversee the transformation of the Toronto waterfront. As part of that mandate, Waterfront Toronto issued a request for proposal seeking partners in that development. Ultimately, what followed was the creation of a public-private partnership between Sidewalk Lab and Waterfront Toronto, known as Sidewalk Toronto. The partnership between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs aimed to improve Toronto's waterfront by creating a technology-driven district. The project promised to stimulate technology and innovation and turn Toronto into the next high-tech and urban tech leader. During the project, Sidewalk Labs faced concerns over digital governance, as the smart city design envisioned extensive deployment of data sensors and surveillance cameras. At every stage of the project, they were confronted with issues surrounding data governance and intellectual property and privacy. Most of the issues came from the local government and communities. The project went through several rounds of negotiation, which ultimately resulted in a decision by Waterfront Toronto to proceed, but on a more reduced scale. And the resolution of the issues involved a significant negotiation with the three levels of government. In conclusion, we can see that the transition to a more knowledge-based and services-based global economy, where these services are located in global cities within multinational enterprises, provides a challenge to international trade and investment policy. This is especially the case for digital and data-based services, the location of which will require the agreement of cities affected, because just like we saw in the Sidewalk Lab case, trade agreements have not yet addressed the relevant issues, and therefore direct negotiation between firms and city agencies occurs. Global cities are critical to this transition and must be incorporated into national economic strategies. This requires going much further than simply consulting cities on matters such as trade negotiations. It means creating and crafting policies that include cities as central players in the policies. While trade and investment treaties and trade and investment promotion can still be relevant, they are challenged by the rise of a knowledge-based service economy. Inclusion of these issues in trade and investment agreements has proved difficult, while at the same time cities have managed to create conditions that facilitate the growth of global knowledge economy. Finally, multinational firms will need to augment their corporate diplomacy competencies to include these more diverse and complex policy frameworks.